Michael Carter spent 15 years building a life he thought would never fall apart. He worked long hours, missed birthdays he swore he'd never miss again, and told himself every sacrifice was worth it because his family would always have his back. He believed that no matter what happened outside those four walls, home was the one place he'd always be respected. He was wrong. And the night he found out just how wrong he was started with something as small as a bottle of salt sitting at the far end of the dinner table. He asked his son, Ethan, to pass it to him. It was a request he had made 1,000 times before, the kind of ordinary moment that never means anything until it suddenly does. But this time, Ethan didn't just ignore him. He mimicked his father's voice back at him, mocking the exact tone Michael had used, turning a simple ask into a joke at his expense. And across the table, his wife, Rachel, the woman who had promised to stand beside him through anything, didn't correct their son. She didn't even flinch. She stifled a laugh, looked away, and let the moment hang in the air like it belonged there. Michael sat frozen, his fork halfway to his plate, replaying what had just happened. This was not the family he remembered building. This was not the woman who once told him she admired how hard he worked for them. Something had shifted, quietly, over weeks he hadn't fully paid attention to, and this dinner was the first time it had shown itself so plainly, right in front of him, with no way to pretend he hadn't seen it. He gave that family everything he had, and the day he lost his job, the day the paycheck stopped and the title disappeared, was the same day something inside his own home started to change. It was as if his worth in that house had been tied to a job title the entire time, and once that job was gone, so was the respect that used to come with it. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. It was there in the way Ethan spoke to him now, and in the silence Rachel offered instead of stepping in. This is the story of how one job loss exposed a marriage no one thought would break, a 15-year foundation that cracked in a matter of months, and a father who had to decide how much disrespect he was willing to accept inside his own home before he finally did something about it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how it happened, moment by moment, and what Michael ultimately chose to do to take his life and his son's respect back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael was not a man who complained. He was not a man who demanded praise for doing what he believed a husband and father was supposed to do. He simply worked, provided, and trusted that the people he loved would recognize the effort even if they never said it directly. Rachel had been his wife for 16 years. Ethan was 14, still young enough to be shaped by whatever example was placed in front of him, and old enough to know exactly what he was doing when he mocked his father in front of her. What happened at that table was not an isolated outburst. It was the visible tip of something that had been building inside that house for months, something Michael had chosen not to examine too closely, because looking at it honestly meant admitting his family had changed in ways he did not want to accept. So before we go further, there are 3 questions worth holding onto as this story unfolds. Was Rachel's silence at that dinner table a single lapse in judgment, or had she been quietly encouraging this shift in her son for far longer than Michael realized? Why did Ethan, a boy who once idolized his father, suddenly find it so easy to disrespect him? And what, exactly, did Michael finally do once he could no longer pretend the disrespect in his own home was something he could simply work harder to fix? Keep those questions in mind, because every answer is going to arrive slower than you expect, and every answer is going to explain something about that dinner table moment that you did not see coming. Michael and Rachel met when they were both in their mid-20s, at a time in their lives when neither of them had much money, but both of them had a lot of confidence in what they wanted their future to look like. Michael was working his way up in logistics, the kind of steady, unglamorous career that rewards patience and consistency more than luck. Rachel was finishing a degree in business administration and talked often about the kind of home she wanted to build one day. A home with stability at its center, the kind of stability she had not always had growing up. Michael liked that about her. He liked that she had a plan, and he liked that she seemed to respect the fact that he was building one too, slowly, without shortcuts. They married 2 years later, and within a decade they had built exactly the life they had once only talked about. Michael had worked his way into a management position at the same company he joined in his 20s, the kind of loyalty that used to mean something and, for a long time, did. Rachel stayed home with Ethan for the first several years, and later returned to part-time work once he was old enough for school. On the surface, they looked like a family that had figured it out. They took vacations every summer. They hosted holidays. Michael coached Ethan's baseball team for 4 seasons in a row, standing on the sidelines in the heat, driving him to early practices before work, never once making Ethan feel like it was an inconvenience. Even on the mornings, it absolutely was. There is an old home video, still saved on a hard drive somewhere, of Ethan at maybe 4 years old, sitting on Michael's shoulders at the beach, laughing so hard he could barely hold on. Rachel is the one filming, and at one point you can hear her voice in the background saying, almost proudly, that Michael works too much, but at least he works. It was said with affection at the time, a small joke between two people who trusted each other completely. Nobody watching that video back then would have guessed how differently that same sentence would sound years later, once the circumstances around it had changed. But underneath the vacations and the baseball games and the home videos, there were smaller things happening that nobody outside the marriage ever saw. Michael's hours kept growing longer as his responsibilities at work increased, and Rachel began carrying more of the invisible weight at home almost by default. The school pickups, the appointments, the emotional check-ins with Ethan that Michael simply did not have the time or the energy for anymore. She never confronted Michael directly about it. That was not how Rachel operated. Instead, she absorbed it, year after year, telling herself it was temporary, that things would balance out eventually, that Michael's career was for all of them anyway, so it was worth the imbalance. What Michael did not fully understand, because Rachel never said it plainly, was that her respect for his work ethic had slowly, quietly, become tangled up with something else entirely, a growing resentment about what that work ethic was costing her personally. She admired that he provided. She was also exhausted by everything providing required of her in return, and exhaustion, left unspoken long enough, tends to find other ways of expressing itself. Rachel began making small comments about Michael's absence in front of Ethan, comments that seemed harmless in isolation, jokes about Dad always being busy, sighs when Michael missed dinner because of a late meeting. Ethan absorbed all of it the way children absorb everything, without fully understanding what any of it meant, only understanding the tone underneath it. By the time Ethan turned 12, Michael had become, in a sense, a provider first and a present father second, not because he wanted it that way, but because the demands of keeping the household running the way Rachel expected required exactly that trade-off. Michael told himself the sacrifice was temporary too. He told himself that once he made it to the next level at work, once the promotion came through, once the mortgage felt less tight, he would have more time, more presence, more of himself to give back to his family. He believed, the way a lot of people in his position believe, that the respect he had built over the years was permanent, that it had been earned and banked, and would simply be there waiting for him whenever he was ready to collect it. He had no idea that the entire foundation of that respect, the one he assumed was unconditional, had actually been built on something far more fragile than he realized. It had been built on the paycheck, and on the title, and on the role he played as the reliable provider in a household that had quietly started measuring his worth by what he brought home rather than who he was. Nobody had decided this consciously. Nobody sat down and agreed that Michael's value in that family was tied to his employment status. It had simply happened, gradually, the way most dangerous shifts in a marriage happen, without anyone marking the exact day it started. Which is exactly why, when Michael lost his job, nobody in that house, including Michael himself, understood right away just how much was actually about to change. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that gave no warning of what was coming. Michael had been at the company for 12 years, had survived 2 rounds of layoffs before this one, and had genuinely believed, based on his performance reviews and his tenure, that he was safe. He was called into a conference room at 9:15, sat across from someone in human resources he barely recognized, and was told in under 5 minutes that his position had been eliminated due to restructuring. There was a severance package. There was a folder of paperwork. There was a security escort to collect his belongings from a desk he had sat at for over a decade, as though 12 years of loyalty could be reduced to a cardboard box and a short walk to the parking lot. He sat in his car for almost 40 minutes before he could bring himself to drive home. He replayed the conversation over and over, searching for something he could have done differently, some warning sign he had missed, even though there had been none. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there again, rehearsing how he was going to tell Rachel, trying to find language that made this sound less permanent than it felt, less frightening than it actually was. He walked inside and found her in the kitchen, and before he had even finished the first sentence, he watched her face change, not into worry for him, but into something closer to calculation, as though she were already running numbers in her head, already recalculating what this meant for the mortgage, for Ethan's activities, for the version of their life she had spent years assuming was stable. Rachel's initial reaction was controlled, almost clinical. She asked about the severance amount before she asked how he was feeling. She asked how long he thought it would take to find something comparable before she offered any words of comfort. Michael told himself this was just how Rachel processed stress, that she needed facts before feelings, and that her support would come once the practical questions were answered. He gave her the benefit of the doubt, the way he had given her the benefit of the doubt for years, because that is what love does early on. It fills in the gaps with generosity rather than suspicion. But something in the way Rachel spoke about him began to shift almost immediately, in small ways that were easy to dismiss individually and much harder to dismiss once they started stacking up. Within the first week, Michael noticed that Rachel had stopped introducing him the way she used to at the grocery store or in passing conversations with neighbors. She no longer said, "This is my husband, he works at," and let the sentence trail off naturally into whatever came next. Instead, when the subject came up, she would say he was in between things right now, her tone flat, almost apologetic, as though his unemployment were something that needed to be explained away rather than simply stated as a fact of their current circumstances. Michael applied to jobs every single day. He treated the search itself like a full-time position, waking up early, dressing the way he used to for work, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop for hours, refining his resume, following up on applications, reaching out to old contacts from his industry. He was not sitting idle. He was not giving up. But results in a job search do not arrive on anyone's preferred timeline. And as weeks turned into a month, and then two, the tension inside the house began to build in ways that were increasingly difficult to ignore. Money conversations became sharper. Rachel began making decisions unilaterally that she previously would have discussed with Michael first, canceling certain subscriptions, adjusting Ethan's extracurricular schedule, rearranging the household budget without walking Michael through her reasoning the way she once would have. Michael understood the necessity of the adjustments. What stung was not the budgeting itself, but the way Rachel had quietly repositioned herself as the one now steering the household, while positioning Michael, without ever saying it outright, as someone temporarily along for the ride rather than an equal partner in the decisions being made. At dinner one evening, roughly 5 weeks into his unemployment, Michael mentioned that he had a promising second interview scheduled for later that week. Rachel responded with a comment that Michael would replay in his mind for a long time afterward. She said, in front of Ethan, that it would be nice if something actually came through this time, her tone light on the surface but carrying an edge underneath it that Michael recognized immediately, even if Ethan, at 14, only picked up on the tone without fully understanding the weight behind it. Michael said nothing in response. He simply nodded and finished his dinner, telling himself once again that this was stress talking, that Rachel did not mean it the way it sounded, that things would improve once he was working again. What Michael did not yet realize was that Ethan had been paying far closer attention to these small moments than either parent gave him credit for. Children do not need things explained to them directly in order to absorb the emotional temperature of a household. Ethan had noticed his mother's tone shifting whenever his father's job search came up. He had noticed the sighs, the flat comments, the subtle way Rachel now spoke about Michael with something closer to disappointment than partnership. And somewhere in that noticing, without any adult in the house consciously teaching him to do so, Ethan began forming his own opinion about what his father's unemployment meant about his father as a man. It was during this same stretch of weeks that Michael first noticed a change in the way Ethan spoke to him directly, small at first, a slight edge in his tone when Michael asked him to do something around the house, a longer pause before Ethan responded to a simple request, as though weighing whether his father's instructions still carried the same authority they used to. Michael brushed it off as typical teenage behavior, the kind of pushback every parent expects eventually. He had no way of knowing yet that this shift in Ethan was not a coincidence. and that it was directly connected to something Rachel had said to Ethan privately, a conversation Michael would not learn about until much later, a conversation that would completely change how he understood everything that had been happening inside his own home. The turning point, the one Michael would later identify as the moment everything truly shifted, happened almost by accident, on an afternoon that started out completely unremarkable. Ethan had a friend over after school, and while the two boys sat at the kitchen counter, Ethan made a joke about Michael still not having a job, mimicking, almost perfectly, the exact tone Rachel had used weeks earlier at dinner. Rachel was standing at the counter at the time, and instead of correcting Ethan, instead of stepping in the way a parent typically would when a child mocks the other parent in front of a guest, she let out a short laugh before catching herself. It was brief. It was quiet. But Michael, who happened to be walking past the kitchen at that exact moment, heard every second of it. He said nothing in the moment. He walked past, went into the other room, and sat with what he had just witnessed for a long time afterward. That laugh, small as it was, told him something he had been avoiding admitting to himself for weeks. Rachel was not simply failing to correct Ethan's growing disrespect. On some level, she was finding it amusing, or worse, she was quietly approving of it, treating Michael's diminished status in the household as something almost deserved, a natural consequence of him no longer being the provider he once was. From that point forward, Michael began paying closer attention, and once he started looking for the pattern, he could not stop seeing it everywhere. Ethan began skipping chores that Michael assigned him, not with outright refusal, but with a kind of passive delay, waiting to see if Michael would simply do the task himself rather than enforce it. When Michael did try to enforce it, Ethan would talk back in a tone that carried an edge of contempt Michael did not recognize from his son, a tone that, unsettlingly, sounded almost exactly like something Rachel might say. Michael began to wonder how much of what he was hearing from his 14-year-old son was actually coming from Ethan at all, and how much of it was simply Rachel's private commentary, absorbed and repeated by a child who trusted his mother completely. One evening, while Michael was in the garage sorting through boxes of old work files he no longer needed, he overheard Rachel on the phone in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the thin wall between the two rooms. She was talking to a friend, and though Michael only caught fragments of the conversation, what he heard stopped him completely. Rachel described him, in that private conversation, as someone she barely recognized anymore, someone who used to have direction and now seemed lost, someone who, in her words, was not the man she thought she married. She said it casually, almost conversationally, the way people speak when they believe no one else is listening. Michael stood frozen in the garage, a box of old files still in his hands, absorbing the fact that his wife was describing him to a friend using language far harsher than anything she had ever said to his face. He did not confront her that night. He told himself he needed time to process what he had heard, time to determine whether he had misunderstood the context, though deep down he already knew he had not. Over the following days, Michael began noticing the pattern extend beyond just Rachel and Ethan individually, and start to appear in the way the two of them interacted with each other when Michael was present, a kind of unspoken alliance forming, small glances between mother and son whenever Michael spoke, small smirks that suggested a shared understanding Michael was no longer part of. There is a version of this story where Rachel's behavior could be explained away as unintentional, a byproduct of her own fear and financial anxiety rather than a deliberate campaign against her husband. People under enough stress often project their frustrations onto whoever is closest, and Michael, as the person whose job loss had triggered the anxiety in the first place, was the closest and easiest target available. Under this reading, Rachel was not consciously teaching Ethan to disrespect his father. She was simply venting her own fear in front of a child who absorbed her tone without either of them realizing the damage it was doing. But there is another version of this story that Michael could not fully dismiss either, one where Rachel's behavior was less about unconscious projection and more about a quiet reassessment of the marriage itself, a slow, deliberate repositioning of her own authority in the household now that Michael's traditional role as provider had been disrupted. Under this reading, the comments to Ethan, the laughs left uncorrected, the private conversations with friends, were not accidental slips born out of stress. They were, whether Rachel would have admitted it or not, the early signs of someone testing what the marriage looked like with Michael holding less power than he used to, and finding that she did not entirely dislike what she saw. Michael did not know which version was true, and that uncertainty was, in some ways, more exhausting than either possibility on its own. What he did know was that the disrespect happening in his home was no longer occasional. It had become the default tone, the new normal, the water everyone in that house was now swimming in without acknowledging it out loud. The flashpoint that finally made this undeniable, even to Michael, happened in public, at a family gathering roughly 2 months after the layoff. Michael had asked Ethan, calmly and reasonably, to help carry some folding chairs from the car into a relative's backyard, the kind of simple request that required no real effort. Ethan ignored him at first, continuing to scroll through his phone, and when Michael repeated the request, Ethan responded with a dismissive comment about Michael not having anything better to do with his time anyway, since he did not have a job to go to. The comment landed in front of several extended family members, and for a brief, uncomfortable moment, conversation around them paused. Rachel, standing only a few feet away, said absolutely nothing. She did not correct Ethan. She did not apologize to Michael. She simply looked away, as though the silence itself was easier than acknowledging what had just happened. An older relative nearby, someone who had known Michael for years, gave him a look that told Michael everything he needed to know, a look of quiet, uncomfortable recognition, the kind that confirms a suspicion has been noticed by more than just the person living inside it. Michael carried the chairs himself, said nothing further, and spent the rest of the gathering replaying the moment in his mind, the public nature of it making the private pattern he had been tracking for weeks suddenly, undeniably real. That night, driving home in near silence, Michael finally understood something with total clarity. This had stopped being a difficult stretch caused by unemployment. It had become a fundamental shift in how his own family regarded him, a shift that had been building steadily since the day he lost his job, and one that neither Rachel nor Ethan seemed inclined to correct on their own. Whatever had been said, whatever conversations had happened between mother and son when Michael was not in the room, the results were now visible in nearly every interaction inside that house. And Michael understood that if he did not do something about it soon, this was not a phase that would simply pass once he found new employment. It was becoming who they were. 3 days after the gathering, Michael decided he could no longer stay silent. He waited until Ethan had gone to bed, and he sat down with Rachel in the living room, telling her plainly that they needed to talk about what had happened in front of the family and about everything that had led up to it. Rachel's first instinct was defensive. She said Michael was overreacting, that Ethan was simply going through a difficult age, that Michael was reading too much into a handful of comments made under stressful circumstances. Michael, calmer than he expected to be, told her about the phone call he had overheard weeks earlier, the one where she described him to a friend as someone she'd barely recognized. Rachel went quiet. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Rachel, visibly shaken that Michael had heard that conversation, began to speak in a way she had not allowed herself to before, not defensively, but honestly, as though something in her had finally run out of room to keep hiding. She admitted that Michael's job loss had frightened her far more deeply than she had ever expressed to him directly. She admitted that she had built a large part of her own sense of security around the stability Michael's income provided, and that watching that stability disappear had triggered fears she had carried since childhood, fears rooted in her own upbringing, in a household where financial uncertainty had once caused real damage to her family. Rachel confessed that instead of voicing that fear honestly, she had let it curdle into something else entirely, a quiet resentment she had not fully acknowledged even to herself, a resentment she had, without meaning to at first, started expressing through small comments and unspoken permissions given to Ethan. She admitted, painfully, that on some level she had allowed Ethan's disrespect toward Michael to continue partly because it gave her a strange, uncomfortable sense of control at a time when she felt she had none, as though diminishing Michael's authority in small ways somehow made her own fear feel more manageable. It was not something she was proud of. It was not something she had done with full awareness in the moment. But hearing herself say it out loud, for the first time, made it impossible to deny any longer. Michael sat with what Rachel had just told him, feeling a mixture of anger and something closer to sorrow, because what she described was not a cruel woman deliberately trying to destroy her husband standing in his own home. It was a frightened one, someone who had let her fear metastasize into behavior she had not fully examined until forced to say it out loud. Understanding the reason behind Rachel's actions did not erase the damage those actions had caused, but it did give Michael a clearer picture of what he was actually dealing with, and what would need to change if this marriage was going to survive. The following weekend, Michael sat down with Ethan alone, away from Rachel, and asked him directly why he had started speaking to him the way he had. Ethan, 14 and clearly uncomfortable, struggled at first to answer honestly. Rachel, to her credit, did not resist the boundary. She had already admitted, painfully, what she had allowed to happen, and in the months that followed she made visible, consistent changes, correcting Ethan the moment any disrespectful comment surfaced, and speaking about Michael, both to his face and to others, with the same regard she had shown him before his job loss ever happened. It was not an instant transformation. Trust, once damaged in a home, does not repair itself on anyone's convenient timeline. But the effort was real, and Michael, watching it unfold week after week, slowly allowed himself to believe that this marriage, cracked as it had become, was not necessarily finished. Michael also rebuilt his relationship with Ethan directly, spending more one-on-one time with him, not lecturing him about respect in the abstract, but simply being present in the way he had been before his career demanded so much of his attention. Ironically, the job loss that had triggered the entire crisis eventually gave Michael something he had not had in years: unstructured time with his son, time he used deliberately to repair what had been damaged. 6 months after that dinner table moment, Michael found new employment, a role that paid slightly less than his previous position but offered significantly better hours that let him remain the present, involved father he had rediscovered how to be during the hardest stretch of his life. Somewhere between the paycheck and the mortgage, respect inside that home had quietly become conditional, tied to a job title rather than to who Michael actually was as a husband and a father. It took losing everything, the position, the income, the easy assumption that his worth was permanent, for Michael to see that clearly, and it took Rachel confronting her own fear honestly for that respect to become unconditional again. Not every family in this situation gets the version of the ending Michael and his family found. Some marriages do not survive the exposure of what was hiding beneath the surface all along. This one did, but only because two people were willing to look honestly at what had happened, and only because a 14-year-old boy was brave enough to admit, out loud, that he had gotten something badly wrong. Was Rachel protecting herself, or punishing Michael for something that was never truly his fault to begin with? Would you have noticed the shift happening in your own home before Michael finally did? Let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below. Stories like Michael's are more common than most people realize, playing out quietly in homes everywhere, rarely spoken about, because admitting them feels like admitting failure. But the truth is, moments like the one at that dinner table happen for reasons far more complicated than they first appear, shaped by fear, by unspoken expectations, and by the quiet ways a family's sense of respect can shift without anyone fully noticing until the damage is already done. If Michael's story resonated with you, if any part of it reminded you of something you have lived through yourself, we would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you found yourself invested in how this one played out, wait until you hear what happened when a mother tried to warn her daughter about a pattern she recognized from her own life, and nobody in that family was willing to listen until it was almost too late. That story is coming soon, and it is one you will not want to miss. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss any of the real-life stories we bring you every week. We will see you in the next one.